box. We'll be monitoring those for later. Thank you, Gert.
Thank you, Karen. I'm going to illustrate this just with a few slides showing the practical lessons learned. Can I just check that you can see the presentation clearly?
We can. Thank you very much.
The first point to make is that climate risk has really gone mainstream the past 18 months, and there's been a very clear inflection point in terms of engaging with various stakeholders that occurred. It moved from the realm where there was a lot of theory, a lot of research, and a lot of compliance focus to really a mainstream risk that you need to manage, not only from a prudential perspective or from a risk management governance perspective, but from a business perspective. And I've outlined some of the key catalysts as to why I think it became mainstream. The first one to note is the fact that climate risk is not something that is happening in the future. It is evident right now. And you can see it on the far left, where financial markets are already pricing in climate risk. So if you look at green assets across a variety of ratings, and you look at conventional assets, you will see that the assets do not price the same way. And in general, the spread can be as little as 5 to 10 basis points different for the highly rated assets, as much as 50 basis points different for the lower rated assets. And this is still something that is finding a true level, but the present value of the future impacts, whether you're talking about physical risk or transition risks, are already being priced into the financial markets. This was not always the case, but over the past 12 to 18 months, it has become ever more clearer that the financial markets are making a difference. So if your business touches the financial markets, like banks, insurers, institutional fund managers, and others, it is a reality for you now because of the way that the financial markets are already pricing the differences. The second point is the fact that clients are already impacted in terms of assessments on them. The extract that there's on the screen comes from Moody's report, where they're covering a variety of sectors in terms of the environmental impacts. And you can see there, simply by virtue of the color coding, where they believe that the elevated risks are immediately there. And as a consequence, credit ratings are impacted already. Clients need to navigate a very complex world. Ourselves also need to manage that world. And then the third area is the sharp rise of ESG rating agencies, TCFD disclosure that has become a lot more common, has certainly been a catalyst, and people are looking at this a lot closer. And then, of course, the regulatory guidance. There are, of course, many other catalysts, but these three are clear catalysts that I can single out that moved it really from an area that you need to pay attention to, but more from a compliance perspective to something that has come into the business itself. And the way that we've really approached that is to recognize these changes and to manage across three dimensions. One is external factors, and to try to understand better what is the investor appetite and market pricing that is occurring because of the views on climate risk. And that requires a lot of engagement to understand this very clearly. One of the key investors, for example, that has indicated that their entire investment process has changed is BlackRock. We engaged with them again, I think about 2 or 3 weeks ago. And the type of questions that they ask around your business and how you manage your business, and the way that they do this, it's not after the fact due diligence, it's before the fact due diligence to decide whether you are an investable company. The way that they look at pricing, if they look at debt instruments versus equity instruments, is making it very real. There's a lot of constructive regulatory guidance that's been issued, regulatory requirements. We saw some of that just now. And then, as I've noted, the TCFD disclosure has certainly been a catalyst, and that is something that we are managing as an external factor. But other more granular metrics such as carbon accounting and others are going to play, in our opinion, a very important role going forward. In terms of FirstRand specifically, we look at it across both strategy and the risk oversight side. I'll talk about that briefly a bit more. And then with clients, we are engaging in advisory capacity with clients, and we are, of course, learning from each other. As we engage with clients, we also learn because we are also subject to the same pressures. You need to start to incorporate this into your risk management, and doing that is not a straightforward matter. Up to very recently, most organizations, including ourselves, would have gone through ESG type assessments, more qualitative assessments, to understand what the risks are. But it's quickly transitioning into more quantitative assessments whereby you need to understand the transitional risk in a lot of granularity. And I've highlighted something that is very useful that comes from the Climate Bonds Initiative, where assets are categorized from near zero, pathway to zero, to stranded assets. But to map assets into those categories to understand the transition risk is again, it is not straightforward. On physical risks, it requires capabilities that you might not have had historically. For example, the geomapping of all your exposures to relevant places and then linking those to external services and maps to show flooding risk and others. There I've just shown an example from the Green Book, but there are various ways and means that we apply in order to get a geomapping of all exposures that we've got, to understand what type of risks are they faced with in terms of whether there's flooding risk, fire risks, drought risks, or similar. And there are micro differences depending on location. The key point to note is, although we tend to talk about physical risk and transition risks as two separate risks, they are not as easily separatable. And there's in fact a strong correlation between the two. If you look at the extremes, and you've got a very rapid transition, that regulatory authorities, governments and others make in order to force the industry in terms of a particular direction, you get lots of transitional risk. In all likelihood, you've got then not a lot of temperature change, which means that the physical risk increase is reduced, but you need to then manage that rapid transitional risks. If there's no transition happening, then the logic is that the temperature would keep on rising and the physical risks intensity would increase a lot. So you can see that the two are very interrelated, and depending on what horizon you're forecasting, you're taking a view more on transitional risks or on physical risk. And those are some of the complexities that we are managing. Some learnings that I thought is useful to share with the audience. We've certainly come to the realization that you cannot look at climate and environmental on its own. You need to look at environmental and social together. This is because wherever there's a transition occurring on this, there are societal impacts. Take, for example, the debate on renewable energy. If you don't look at the societal impacts at the same time, you might have a clean energy source and societal issues. If you look at new energy sources on the African continent, maybe take gas in Mozambique, for example, you have to look at E and S together to understand what your collective impact is, what your collective exposure is. When you engage with external stakeholders, you need to engage on E and S. What my own experience has been, often when we engage with international fund managers, the starting point is E, environmental, quickly go to climate, then quickly go to coal. And you have to explain the impacts of E and S. If you don't do that, people don't understand why you might, for example, continue to have some support in the coal sector as opposed to just cut off funding to it immediately. It is because of the S. We understand the E impact, but the S we also need to understand. It's also clear that the African continent has got some very specific needs that differ from country to country. So it's not even correct to talk about Africa. You need to talk about Mozambique or Ghana or Nigeria or any of these countries in between, and their transition path looks different. There are invariably tension between development and climate priorities, and the role of transitional type assets or energy sources is important. Gas in particular is one that is worthy of a lot of time and debate, that is more neutral than, say, the very high carbon assets, but of course is not as clean as renewable, and it plays different roles in different markets. We found it very important to understand we need to move beyond compliance. In some respects, it was quicker to get a lot of policies and criteria and all of that out there. But if you are not influencing the business, and if you're not driving the business and the climate needs, you are not really going to make progress. And therefore, you need to distinguish between governance versus risk strategy versus business strategy. All three of those require some view. All three of those require a forum where somebody needs to debate that. All three of those need to intersect at some stage, and it requires a lot of internal engagement and education, which is ongoing. As we learn, we need to share the learnings. Business sponsorship at the top of the house is imperative. In our instance, it comes from the chair of the board, and then agreement that the most senior management committee, and that is our strategic executive committee, those are the two key points of sponsorship where we are debating the overall strategy. Even with that sponsorship, it is and remains very complex because it's a complex topic. Without the sponsorship, you can progress a lot on the compliance side. You can optically look good. Practically, your business is not going to be aligned with what you are governing and what you want to comply with. Metrics and measurement complexities I have mentioned here, the difficulty of separating physical and transition risks. And I think probably the biggest one there is to say, with what horizon do you want to measure this? Do you measure the horizon along the lines of what is the average maturity of your book? Or do you want to measure long-dated horizons? And you get different insights, but also different stakeholders. If your book average maturity is 4 years, but you are doing 50-year scenarios, then clearly the business impact of that is going to be very different to say, okay, you want to understand what is the impact right now of what you've got on book. And as a consequence, lots of debates needed on that. Communication is something that is important. TCFD is a particularly powerful vehicle to communicate in, and we found ever since we've ramped up TCFD communication that the engagement with external stakeholders have been a lot more constructive. Interestingly enough, this was our first annual general meeting this morning after we've published a TCFD, because the previous year we did not have separate TCFD disclosures. And the amount of questions coming from institutional shareholders directly referencing TCFD and details on TCFD was very notable. And as a consequence, the moment you put out information, you also need to be prepared to defend what you put out there. I've noted that one need to go beyond this, in particular for financial institutions whose own environmental footprint might not be very extensive in terms of, so own contribution to carbon emissions and all of that is fairly limited, but the indirect contribution through the financing of industries is extensive. And as a consequence, you need to actually explain both of those to people. What are you contributing yourself and what are you facilitating? You need to communicate and you need to disclose. And then finally, stakeholder management and education we found to be something extremely important to spend a lot of time on. We've got a group of people, including myself, including some of the senior business leaders, and including investor relations, that typically jointly engage with the stakeholders depending on who it is that we're engaging with. And we found lots of benefit engaging with people in a coherent, well-coordinated way, but also lots of challenges, and challenges that we again need to take internally into the organization. I think maybe in conclusion, there's a lot happening in this space. The impacts are real. It is happening already. I would say every couple of months you can see a change in terms of engaging with stakeholders, and you need to respond. And that is why it's important to mobilize the right people at the right level of the organization so that one can keep pace here. I don't think anyone has got the full knowledge here, and one need to be humble enough to recognize that there's a lot that you don't know, a lot that you need to learn, and a lot that we need to learn from each other, both as industry participants, but also as co-stakeholders. It is something that we will simply keep on engaging and see how do we progress this, how do we learn of each other's, and how can we manage this very important topic better as we go forward. Thanks, Karen.
Thank you so much, Gert. And I think that gives us an amazing insight into the drivers, the catalysts,